Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Romina Itchan. In this podcast, Tim Anaya, Director of Communications, and I chatted with Salim Furth and Emily Hamilton, both research fellows at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. The lack of affordable housing in California is in such a crisis state that even scholars as far as Virginia are weighing in with ideas. Salim and Emily recently produced a brief on California Senate Bill 827, which would preempt some local restrictions on housing construction near transit stations and frequent bus routes. They believe that the bill, in its current form, is likely to slow or reverse the growth in housing cost. In this podcast, we discuss the specifics of SB 827 and the likely effects and limits if it becomes law. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast, Emily and Salim. How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Great, thanks for having us.
You've written a new brief on California's housing crisis called California Can Improve Housing and Transit by Preempting Local Ordinances. So in this brief, you analyze legislation that could have an impact in paving the way for a more California housing supply. Give us a 30,000-foot view of your brief and talk about what SB 827 would do if enacted.
As residents of California know very well that many markets within the state are experiencing housing crises where prices just seem to be rising with no end in sight, and housing is becoming increasingly inaccessible to the typical California household. In our brief, we talk about Senate Bill 827, which has been proposed by State Senator Scott Wiener. And the stated purpose of the bill is to reduce these restrictions on housing supply within California near transit corridors. And we think that this bill is addressing a very important issue, and the state has a role to play in addressing the local supply restrictions that California cities have enacted that make it very difficult for the market to respond to new housing demand with an increase in supply.
You talk about the challenges that California's housing market faces up and down the state in both trying to meet the demand of the market and also ensure that there's enough supply to keep home prices affordable in California. So based on your research, just how bad is it in California?
There are 283 zip codes in the U.S. where the median home price is above $1 million. 188 of those are in California. And it's not just a problem at the top. Renters are dealing with very high rents in all the major cities of California. So this is really a statewide problem, and it's kind of reached a national scale where the rest of the country, we're in Washington here, D.C., we've noticed just how bad things are out there. California renters do not need to hear from outsiders just how bad things are, but we've noticed here the problems that the market is having there.
Governor Brown has been a leader in suggesting that the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, be reformed to help alleviate the housing crisis. But his stand is against the wishes of some of the people in his own party. What do you find in your research about the role California's environmental laws play in our state's housing crisis?
So no other state has a law like CEQA. It effectively raises the price of housing as well as the price of creating public improvements. Because essentially, anybody can just bring a lawsuit, a challenge under this law and say, well, we don't think the planners of this project properly considered every possible environmental outcome. You know, it's reasonable to have environmental impact laws, and those are in effect in every state in the union. Some are more strict than others. California, even in the absence of CEQA, would have a pretty robust environmental protection law. What's different is this ability to just slow things down, tie things up in court, and effectively add dollars to the cost of a project. And it doesn't take a business genius to figure out that when it costs more to produce something, then the final price has to be higher to justify the creation, right? So if it costs $100,000 more to build a house because of your CEQA challenges, you're going to charge $100,000 more in the end, or you won't build if you don't think the market will bear that. So yeah, CEQA is a really, really badly designed law. And Emily, maybe you can say a word about how it is sort of self-defeating on the environmental side.
Absolutely. California environmentalists should keep in mind that because of the state's very temperate climate that's comfortable year-round. People who live in California tend to have a smaller environmental footprint relative to people who live in states where a lot of energy is needed to heat or cool homes. So rules that obstruct building in California from a broader environmental perspective ultimately result in higher carbon emissions than we could see otherwise.
You know, in your brief, you make the point that the state stepping in and taking a larger role in restraining effectively these local land use regulations, as was proposed in SB 827, would do more to protect individual property rights. Now, some may see this point as counterintuitive, so can you explain how this change would positively impact property rights in California?
Yes, those of us who prefer to see market solutions to public policy problems often have the perspective that local is best and that policy decisions should be made at the lowest level of government possible. But that's not always an appropriate lens for looking at policymaking because of the interaction between local governments. And we argue that states have a role to step in to protect property rights and set minimum standards for what property owners should be allowed to do with the land that they own in cases where local governments are going too far in limiting property rights and market activity. So we argue that, in a sense, the state government has a role to play in setting limits on how far local governments can go in restricting land use.
You also make the case in your brief that reforms like SB 827 would be a policy step toward promoting economic growth. How so?
So a thriving economy is basically a combination of people and opportunities, jobs. Right now, the zoning laws in California are a bottleneck on the people side, right? People are squeezing into apartments to try to connect with the jobs that are available in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Without being able to add more people, you can't effectively add more jobs in California. It just gets harder and harder to find people to fill those jobs. That's not only at the top end, right? If you want to start a business in the Bay Area that employs working class people to do, kinds of basic things that are done all over the country in different economies, that's really hard because those people have to commute in from really far away, and there's not as many of them as ought to be able to pursue opportunities in a place like that. So without allowing people to join your economy, you can have a really good per capita economy, right? So you can make, say San Jose a place where only really highly skilled people, some programmers and engineers live, and it looks really good on a per capita basis. But once you drill down, you realize there's a lot of opportunities that are foregone where the money is there, the technology is there, but if you can't get people, you can't create a job.
In California, transportation has been one of the hottest issues this legislative session. Last year, the legislature enacted a $54 billion tax increase to fund road repair and public transportation and other state transportation needs. And yet I read in your study that one of the potential societal benefits of enacting a reform like SB 827 would be how it would fully maximize the state's investments in public transportation. So talk about how passing something like SB 827 could help the state benefit and really stretch its public transportation dollars to the fullest.
Yeah, under current zoning rules, state investments in transportation and in public transit in particular are really hamstrung because in many cases, the only type of development that's allowed around transit stations is low-density housing development or retail development. So right off the bat, there's a hard limit on how many people will be able to take advantage of these transit investments because of the limits on the development side. And we argue that state and local tax dollars that go to subsidize transit today would be much better spent if there were more freedom for people to live near these very expensive investments. Currently, California taxpayers support over $1 billion in subsidies between state and local spending for transit each year. But if development were allowed to be denser around these transit stations, a larger percentage of transit costs could be paid for by those who actually use transit. Salim, did you want to add?
Yeah, there was a great example in the Bay Area. Caltrain, which runs from San Jose up to San Francisco, doubled its ridership over the past 6 or 7 years, partly due to increased density of homes built near Caltrain stations. And as a consequence of doubling its ridership, it cut its public subsidy in half, right? So it doubled the amount of fare box revenue it was getting, and the operational per passenger subsidy dropped from $3.80 to $1. Now, ideally, transit should be able to at least pay for its own operations. And there's a variety of issues in the U.S., the way the union contracts are written and some of the inefficiencies that make that hard to achieve. But Caltrain's almost there, and that's without much growth at most of its stations. If Caltrain, under SB 827, saw apartment buildings built around most of its transit stops, it would suddenly discover that it has full trains and that it can pay for its own operations, and that's a load off of California taxpayers. So if you live in, Redding, California, and you're like, why should I care about this urban bill one way or the other? Well, one reason is right now you're paying in taxes to support these transit lines, and a full transit line that fills up the seats on its trains or its buses is one that can get close to or achieve paying for itself, and it gets off the taxpayer's back.
Well, anytime state legislation is enacted, there are always unintended consequences that lawmakers didn't imagine. With this legislation, it seems like local officials would just find other ways to get around state limits on their authority. What are some of those loopholes that local officials might exploit if the state moves in that direction?
They could put in a whole bunch of affordable housing mandates to make it harder to build profitable new buildings.
Amendments have been introduced to the bill that would protect local demolition controls. So those could include historic preservation requirements that make it impossible to replace existing buildings with new ones.
Cities could enact more rent control as a way to really discourage developers from coming in and building anything at the market rate.
We talked earlier about CEQA, and SB 827 doesn't do anything to stop environmental challenges to new development.
And then there's also the unintended consequences of people sort of using the tail to wag the dog, right? So the way that it's currently written, SB 827 gives a lot of implicit authority to the people who set bus schedules. Generally, those haven't been political, but if those become political, there's potential problems. I kind of anticipate that the lawmakers will amend the bill so that a change in the bus route doesn't immediately trigger a zoning change. So maybe we set it so that bus rates as of January 1st, 2018 are the ones that matter for saying this is a transit-rich corridor, therefore it has these zoning changes. That would just clear up some of the uncertainty where feeling that all of a sudden a transit agency can rezone your neighborhood, and that's not a good reason to oppose or support this bill. That's not the intent of it.
As an aside, it's interesting on that kind of local elected officials, trying to go around this bill potentially. It certainly has become probably the highest profile bill for local governments across the state, and it seems like every local government is up in arms about this issue. It was also interesting, recently we had the Los Angeles Times debate the candidates for governor, and was interesting, and maybe they're hearing from their local elected official endorsers, but it seemed like every gubernatorial candidate, Democrat and Republican, was opposed to SB 827 for some reason or another. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if this bill goes forward. What's the reaction going forward? Will it really be kind of a sky is falling moment as, mayors and council members seem to be making it out to be? But now for the real...
Any local government official is kind of feel insulted by this, and I respect that, right? There are different levels of government, and part of the design of federalism is for them to resist each other. That's how we keep any one branch from getting too much power. So it's incumbent on those of us who think that state preemption is a good idea in this case, and we think that this is protecting individual property rights, it's incumbent on us to really make our case to the voters and then to some of these local officials. And we shouldn't just try to ramrod and say, oh, well, you don't matter, or, you're just a NIMBYist or something. Federalism is designed to have these messy arguments. And I think what's encouraging to us is that we're seeing this get debated, and we're seeing people who are from pretty far left recognizing that markets are the fundamental solution to providing housing to working people. And that's a big victory in and of itself, even if the policy doesn't change immediately.
So kind of broadening the discussion a little bit, PRI has written extensively on California's housing crisis. And, as you may know, last year there was a big legislative effort to try and alleviate the crisis. Our California scholar, Kerry Jackson, has written that bills in this kind of vein won't really do much to build more housing supply. And he argues that the legislature should stop dictating what kind of housing to build and ease the red tape and, restrictive zoning laws that make it time-consuming and more expensive to build. What are your thoughts on Kerry's arguments here?
One really elegant thing about the design of SB 827 is that it applies based on transit investment. So it applies in wealthy and low-income neighborhoods alike. In past efforts at zoning reform in many cities, reforms have been concentrated in lower-income neighborhoods where the political opposition to new housing is less than it is in some of the most protected single-family, more suburban type of neighborhoods. So SB 827 has the advantage of applying to a very large geographic area in the most expensive markets in the state. For example, most of San Francisco would be affected by the bill. So there are fewer opportunities to get around the deregulation in this case.
Yeah, Tim, I read what Kerry wrote about SB 35, which passed last year, and he very accurately, went through and found all these little self-defeating provisions, like, oh, well, we're going to give you, this tool to get through the regulatory red tape, but only if you use prevailing wage labor. And it's certainly possible that if it is finally passed, that SB 827 will be so watered down and so filled with similarly self-defeating provisions that it doesn't have a big impact in the end. And I think this is just, the progressives need to recognize markets have got to work. You can't harness the market to every single one of your pet things and handcuff it and tie it to this and tie it to that and then expect it to go forward. So what's good about SB 827 is that it carves out some space. It's not the whole state, but it carves out a significant amount of space and says, we're going to let the market work up to some reasonably lax limits in these areas. Not perfect, not the bill that I would write if I got to write whatever bill I wanted and have it passed, but it's got maybe a respectable chance of becoming law and at least of changing the conversation. And if it's left like that, then I think it would have a big impact on housing supply. But if they treat it like they treated SB 35 and other things, and if every little progressive concern and every progressive discomfort with markets gets added in, then Kerry's going to be right. It'll be another thing that, well, it sounds really good. It sounds like we're going to let the market work, but then actually we've just tied so many bells and whistles to this that it's not going anywhere, so the train's never leaving the station, in which case, we would end up agreeing with him. Well, you can't say we're freeing markets, but we're also going to tie, 15 new regulations to.
If Kerry had his way, he'd repeal CEQA entirely and start over again with a regulatory scheme that makes sense for new housing construction and economic development. Should that be the direction that free market advocates should be taking, or rather an incremental approach, which is potentially more realistic and practical?
I think some would say that SB 827 itself is a pretty drastic approach. It goes after neighborhoods that have been protected by single-family zoning that hasn't allowed any denser construction to take place. So while Salim or I might like to see an even more radical bill that would make more construction legal, SB 827 has done a lot to ignite debate in California about the effects of land use regulation, and whether or not it passes, I think it's done a lot to make reform possible.
Yeah, like Emily said earlier, one of the problems with the incremental approach is that it tends to concentrate all of the costs of building in some narrowly defined areas, and those are usually politically less powerful areas, right? So there's some minority renters groups opposition to SB 827 and to upzoning type bills in general, because historically they have had to bear the brunt of the cost. There are costs and benefits to everything, and the idea is, okay, well, we're going to offload all the costs onto these politically powerless neighborhoods, but then the whole community, the whole economy gets to enjoy the benefits. And that's that. I understand the unfairness of that. The benefit of doing something like SB 827 or of repealing or weakening CEQA, which I would totally support, the benefits of those are that they spread the costs and the benefits across the whole state. And you get, if you have a little bit of building everywhere, you can get a lot more total construction with less sense of, oh my gosh, my neighborhood is being completely remade around me, than if you just pick one neighborhood at a time and say, well, we're going to put all the growth right here. And this area of San Francisco, we're just going to dump a whole ton of investment right in here, and that'll solve our housing problem. And taking a broader view and saying, well, hey, every neighborhood could use a little bit more construction, a little bit more investment. That's going to leave people's neighborhoods familiar. A few more neighbors, one new building on each block. That's something that you can accommodate without a big change in what your neighborhood feels like, but still makes a big difference on a regional level. Seattle is really a champion of this. They have broad-based growth. Every neighborhood is growing by a couple percent. There's a few places that are growing really fast, but mostly it's spread widely. And the result is that they've actually been able to bring rents down in apartments.
So finally, we ask you to get out your crystal ball. What do you think are the prospects for the legislature enacting a housing reform bill like SB 827 this year?
Unfortunately, I don't have a good crystal ball for that one. When I first saw the text of SB 827, I thought absolutely no chance this won't go anywhere. But I think even the bill's sponsors have been really surprised by the amount of attention that the bill has received and the debate both for and against passing a law like this. So I think it has more of a chance than many may have initially thought.
So our favorite question here, we've made it a tradition to talk about wine on our podcast, given our close proximity to wine country. Please share with our listeners your recommendation for a wine or beer or other adult beverage that they ought to try.
I would not dare to tell Northern Californians what wine to drink. If you do find yourself stuck in the Northeast with only Northeast wines available, the Riesling is maybe the least bad. But yeah, we will take your recommendations as opposed to vice versa.
But we do have some pretty good beer on the East Coast, and I'd recommend the Dogfish Head Sour.
Well, when I go back to the East Coast later this year to visit my brother, I'll have to check some of that out there. Finally, as we wrap up here, if our listeners are interested in reading your brief or learning more about the work of the two of you or the Mercatus Center, how can they follow along at home?
You can find our brief at mercatus.org, and we're both on Twitter. I'm at EBW Hamilton.
And I'm at Salim Furth, SalimFurth.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again to our guests, Salim Furth and Emily Hamilton. To read their brief, go to the Mercatus Center website at mercatus.org. That's mercatus.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's a number 1. Also, check out our blog Right by the Bay on our website at pacificresearch.org. And if you're in the San Francisco area, please join us on April 11 for a reception for PRI's President Sally Pipes to launch her new book, The False Promise of Single Payer. You'll find the details on our website. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.